Krivax huffed in frustration as he read through the letters scattered across his desk that had been sent to him from Capital City. He would much prefer it if the rest of the world would stay still while he spent his time enjoying himself in a magical city, but it seems fate was not so kind. He could tell that events were slowly beginning to accelerate, and it wouldn't be long before things started to happen very quickly. There was some good news, such as the Weavers finishing their analysis of the Eastern Kingdom's potential trade goods and discovering that Liferoot possessed potent and valuable alchemical properties, especially for healing potions, but most of the news was much less pleasant. "What's bothering you, Krivax?" asked Masrook, pulling his attention away from the history book he had been reading. "Has something happened in Capital City?" With Hadixov sneaking about with his investigations and Krenisov making her final preparations together with Antonidas to create the portal that would allow the first wave of Nerubians to enter Dalaran, Krivax had been left alone in their shared room. Which meant that Masrook hadn't hesitated to make himself comfortable and keep him company. "Nothing has happened in Capital City," said Krivax. "But the situation down south has gotten a lot worse." "What's happening down south?" asked Masrook, closing his book after the conversation turned to a topic that interested him. "It looks like the Horde has most likely begun their invasion of Karsmodan," said Krivax, his expression grim. "Trixie says that nobody is quite certain what's going on, but communication has become unreliable and the most recent messages don't leave room for optimism." "Does that mean the humans are finally preparing for war?" Masrook asked with excitement. "No, they aren't," said Krivax, growing frustrated as he finished reading through Trixie's letter. "The human kingdoms are paying close attention to the invasion, but both Alderac and Gilneas are still holding out." While Krivax already knew that the alliance wouldn't be formed until after the Horde conquered all of Karsmodan aside from Ironforge and Nerubian, it was still extremely frustrating when dealing with it in real life. The war could have been over so much sooner if the human nations had confronted the Horde while the dwarves and the gnomes still had most of their strength. The only thing that their hesitance would accomplish would be more unnecessary deaths. He could already tell that everyone would start scrambling after Karsmodan finally fell. "Cowards," Masrook spat disdainfully. "The Horde has already proven themselves to be a threat, why aren't the humans fighting them?" "I don't know for certain, but I assume it's a combination of greed and selfishness," Krivax said as he put away the depressing letter and pulled out the next one. "Alderac is weak and has a hostile relationship with Stromgarde. If they lose too many soldiers during the war, then they risk being conquered after it's over. I imagine they want to see how well Ironforge and Nerubian do against the Horde before they make any commitments, hoping that they can grind them down against their defenses." "And Gilneas?" Masrook asked after a moment of silent consideration. "Why are they so unwilling to cooperate with the other humans?" Krivax took a moment to consider Masrook's question. "If I remember correctly, the only reason given in the lore is that Greymane was just an arrogant fool who thought he didn't need help." "I don't know," Krivax said finally after failing to come up with an explanation. "From what we've been told, Gilneas has a fairly powerful military and defensible geography. They don't really have the same worries as Alderac. I've read they are pretty isolationist, not unlike Azjol Nerub. Maybe they think even if the Horde comes they can fight them off without help, although I don't really understand enough about their politics to really give a good guess." You should go back to Capital City and convince them," said Masrook, his tone completely serious. Krivax turned to face his friend, completely befuddled. "What makes you think I could succeed in convincing them when Lordaeron's best diplomats have failed?" asked Krivax, curious about his friend's reasoning. "You are Krivax. You can convince the surface races about anything," Masrook said confidently. Krivax couldn't help but simply stare at Masrook for a few moments in dumbfounded silence. "Oh, I get it. I'm glad you have so much confidence in me, buddy, but I don't think I'd be able to do anything that Lordaeron's diplomats couldn't," said Krivax, after taking a moment to compose himself. "The only reason I've been successful in getting people to do things is that the things I've been getting them to do were obviously in their own interest." Masrook huffed mulishly and muttered something under his breath, but didn't bother arguing with him. As Krivax read through the next letter, he wished he was actually as capable of convincing people to do what he wanted as Masrook thought he was. It would certainly make dealing with this newest issue easier. It seems that the High King's order to discreetly evaluate how the kingdoms would react to the creation of a Nerubian settlement was starting to show results. Diplomats from both Alterac and Stormwind had approached Anuba Khan privately and expressed interest in perhaps ceding some of their lands for a certain price. Normally this was the kind of development that Krivax would be more than happy to see, if it weren't for the fact that Alterac's steel was by far superior to Stormwind's. The problem was that the current ruler of Alterac was Aiden Perinalda, a cowardly and opportunistic king who was only noteworthy in the lore for betraying the alliance to the Horde, believing it was the best way to save his own kingdom. Krivax really didn't want to know what such a person could end up doing if he managed to secure an alliance with a nation as powerful as Azjol-Nerub. While Stormwind was offering more land than Alterac, they were also asking that Azjol-Nerub involve itself directly in the war, something Krivax knew the High King would not find appealing. Alterac, on the other hand, was willing to cede a portion of its lands for a certain amount of treasure and diplomatic guarantees that Azjol-Nerub not attack Alterac, or allow Stromgarde to pass through their territory. Their mountains would make prime nest city locations, likely had resources that could be mined out easily by Nerubian's hands that Alterac would be the first to benefit from, and having a powerful empire sitting in front of the kingdom would seriously discourage Stromgarde's usual skirmishes with them if not outright stop them. It didn't help that Alterac was situated in a location that could very well become a crossroads for trade between the various kingdoms if properly exploited. Krivax wished that he had a way to convince the leadership to go with Stormwind, but he knew that there was little he could do. Although he was the one responsible for leading the Nerubians to the eastern kingdoms, Krivax was starting to feel more and more like he was caught up in a tide of events that he couldn't control. It really made him once again hope that everyone would just stop doing things and allow him to enjoy his time in Dalaran. As if to emphasize the foolishness of that hope, the sudden sound of someone knocking loudly on the door caused Krivax to let out an exasperated sigh. Ever since the duel, there had been random mages trying to meet up with Hadix for one reason or another. Normally, Hadix just sent them running with a threatening display of his magic, but he wasn't here right now, so Krivax would have to be the one to deal with it. With a short glance at Masrouk, the two of them silently made their way to the door and opened it, revealing an elvish woman waiting on the other side. Krivax stepped out into the courtyard outside their lodgings, forcing the woman back, and closed the door behind him as soon as Masrouk stepped out. Krivax didn't know who the woman was, but he couldn't allow anyone outside of the delegation to notice that Hadix wasn't where he was supposed to be. "Can I help you?" Krivax asked the woman, who was sputtering in outrage after being pushed out of the way. The woman seemed to take a moment to compose herself before speaking. "Yes, I suppose you can. Are you Vizier Hadix?" "No, I am Vizier Krivax, student of Vizier Hadix. He is very busy right now and has asked that nothing disturb him short of the Council of Six themselves," Krivax said while making a show of looking the elf over. "And you are not one of them. I'll have you know I am Mervada Summerfall, apprentice to Magistrix Landra Dawnstrider, and I come on important business," said the elf, puffing herself up in anger at the slight. "Are you here as a representative of Quel'Thalas?" Krivax asked tiredly, already knowing the answer. "Well, no. I here Then I'm afraid, apprentice, that Vizier Hadix is not very interested in speaking with you at this time," Krivax said firmly, already turning away to head back inside. He had enough experience dealing with situations like this by now that he knew politeness would not get him very far. Unfortunately, Apprentice Summerfall was a little braver than most and didn't hesitate to grab onto his robe to stop him from leaving. Krivax noticed Masrouk bristle and reach for his weapon, but he quickly called off his friend with a gesture. "This is a matter of the utmost importance." Krivax relented and listened to what the elf had to say, and was unsurprised to find that it was not actually a matter of the utmost importance. Apparently, Magistrix Dawnstrider had been so impressed by Hadix's magic that she was offering to pay the vizier if he taught her what he knew. However, after listening for a few moments, Krivax knew that nothing that the Magistrix had to offer was worth Hadix's time. It was just about when the apprentice was starting to tell him about how much of an opportunity this was for them to receive the backing of someone as important as Magistrix Dawnstrider that Krivax had enough. "As I said before, Vizier Hadix does not wish to be disturbed," said Krivax, removing the elf script from his robes. "Please leave." "Excuse me? I won't be leaving until I spea. "You will leave, or you will be removed," said Masrouk, gripping onto his spear and moving threateningly. Like most sane people, Apprentice Summerfall faltered when confronted with a giant, fully armored spider person, but seemed to be gathering her courage when their confrontation was interrupted by the opening of the door behind Krivax. "You heard him, elf. Leave," said Vizier Hadix, sounding extremely annoyed with the situation. "Vizier Hadix, I presume?" asked the elf, completely ignoring the vizier's tone of voice. It was an impressive display of her lack of self-preservation. "Well met, I am Merv. I will not repeat myself," said Hadix, the magic around him beginning to grow agitated in a display that promised violence if the elf didn't leave immediately. That seemed to be enough to get through to her because after a soft whimper of fear, she quickly made herself scarce. "Leave us, neophyte Masrook," said Hadix, turning to retreat back into the room. Krivax assumed that Hadix probably wanted to talk about the results of his investigation, so he quickly followed the vizier after giving a short goodbye to Masrook, closing the door behind him. It didn't take long for Krivax to realize that the vizier was agitated by more than two persistent elves. "Vizier Hadix, is everything all right?" asked Krivax, growing increasingly concerned as he watched his mentor pace back and forth in the room. "I have not yet found confirmation, but I'm starting to believe that the higher-ranking members of the Kirin Tor are well aware of the void," said Hadix, continuing to pace as he explained the situation. "I've even begun to suspect that one of their members, a mage by the name of is actively practicing void magic in the city." Krivax wasn't particularly surprised to hear that. He was already aware from the lore that the mages of Dalaran sometimes practiced less reputable magic in secret, even if he didn't remember specific names. "What are we going to do about it?" asked Krivax, doing his best to feign surprise. Thankfully, Hadix was too agitated to notice. "I don't know yet," admitted Hadix, ending his rapid pacing as he took on a thoughtful expression. "It's obvious to me that the Order will need to establish a permanent presence in the Eastern Kingdoms. We'll also need to send some of our own people to join the Kirin Tor as quickly as possible so that we can continuously monitor the city for the Void's corruption." "Then, wouldn't it be best if you joined them yourself?" asked Krivax, suggesting the solution that seemed the most obvious to him. It made him uneasy to see his normally stoic mentor so agitated, so he was glad that the vizier was beginning to calm down. He must really hate the void. "No. My time and skills are too valuable for me to be wasted on something like that," Hadix said matter-of-factly. Besides, the Order was wise enough to include some of its own members within the initial group coming to Dalaran. "After the portal is opened and I am provided assistance from my colleagues, it won't be long before I can finish my investigation, although there are still portions of the city that I won't be able to easily access." "Really?" Krivax asked in surprise. "Isn't Dalaran's warding much worse than ours?" It shouldn't surprise him as much as it did that there were places in the city that Hadix couldn't access, but he had seen for himself some of the spells that the Order had developed to sneak around in the spellbook that Hadix had given him. They were very good at going places where they didn't belong and remaining unnoticed while they did so. That coupled with Hadix's personal strength had resulted in Krivax beginning to believe that nothing could stop his mentor from going wherever he wanted. "The wards protecting the Grand Library are connected directly to the city's leyline nexus," explained Hadix, hissing softly in frustration. "Even if their wards are far inferior to our own, it's nearly impossible to bypass wards connected to such vast amounts of arcane energies, especially unnoticed." Krivax silently watched his mentor for several moments as the vizier started muttering to himself, seemingly losing himself in his thoughts. "There's no need for us to make any decisions right now, Vizier Hadix," said Krivax when it became obvious Hadix wouldn't continue the conversation without prompting. "We still have some time before the delegation needs to return to Capital City. Our presence will be needed to help the Enclave establish itself in Dalaran. There aren't very many Nerubians who speak Common after all." Krivax wasn't looking forward to spending more time resolving cultural misunderstandings, but it certainly was convenient that their part of the delegation would be staying in the city for a while longer. It meant that Krivax was confident that he would have enough time to handle his personal goals before he left. According to the schedule that Antonidas had given him, Crossus wouldn't be scheduled to teach a class for at least a few more weeks. "Humph. You may be correct," Hadix admitted grudgingly. "I should have enough time to conclude my investigation before we leave and present my findings to the Order. My instincts tell me that these people are hiding something important, so I'll be recommending that the Order makes investigating the Kirin Tor a priority." "Oh, Vizier Hadix, you have no idea. Krivax hoped that he would be there to see Hadix's reaction once he learned about the Burning Legion, a force that was just as much of a threat as the old gods. It would be nice when he wasn't the only one in the room quietly freaking out about the constant world-ending threats facing Azeroth. For now, we should begin making our way to Vizier Krines, said Hadix, turning to face him for the first time since the conversation began. I've recently received word that they are prepared to open the portal. Our presence is necessary to translate for those who do not speak common. Of course, said Krivax, nodding eagerly and already moving toward the door. Let's start making our way there now. Even if he knew it was going to cause him many headaches in the future, it would be nice to have more Nerubians in Dalaran and to start constructing their enclave. After living in Azjol Nerub for so long, it was hard for him to get used to living back above ground. It didn't take long for the two viziers and their warrior escort to make their way through the streets of Dalaran and reach their destination, a heavily guarded building near the city's main guardhouse. Even if it weren't for the two guardsmen wearing complete sets of enchanted armor and standing by the entrance to the building, Krivax would be able to tell that the building was important simply by the dense array of wards covering every inch of it. It wasn't a surprise to him that Dalaran was taking the security of the location so seriously, given this is where they would be opening up a portal to a powerful empire that they knew little about. The only reason why they would even consider such a thing is because they had absolute confidence in their ability to ensure their city's safety, and the guards and the wards were a part of that. Vizier Hadix didn't seem to share his interest in the building's security and smoothly walked past the guards without any hesitation, forcing Krivax to quickly follow behind him. Obviously, there wasn't much need to show identification. As Krivax followed Hadix through the twisting and heavily guarded hallways, it became obvious to him that this wasn't the vizier's first time in the building. Soon enough, Krivax followed his mentor through yet another nondescript hallway only to find himself in a massive chamber positively glowing with arcane energies. Vizier Krines could be seen standing in the chamber's center speaking with Archmage Antonidas as the two of them gestured to the arcane glyphs spread out across the floor. Several teams of mages were busy looking over a complex series of wards that were constructed around what Krivax assumed would be the actual portal site. Vizier Hadix. Good, you're here, called out Vizier Krines from across the room as soon as she caught sight of them. Please tell this human that this portion of the ritual is completely unnecessary. His paranoia is going to make this portal far less efficient than it could be. Why would we need to go to such excessive lengths to diffuse the portal's ambient arcane energy? I understand things might be different where you come from, but this city has regulations about how much arcane energies can be legally permitted in such a small area, Antonidas said calmly. So you've said, but you've refused to explain the reason for the regulations, no matter how many times I've asked, said Krines, raising her voice in frustration. Then perhaps you should stop asking, said Antonidas, allowing a hint of annoyance to enter his voice. You do not need to understand all of our laws, you simply need to obey them. The ritual will work fine, despite these modifications. Krivax watched from the side as Hadix examined the portion of the glyphs in question before glancing at Antonidas. Krivax knew that he was probably the only one in the room who knew Hadix well enough to see the hint of suspicion in his eyes. This is not our city, Vizier Krines, Hadix said finally after a long moment of silence. If Archmage Antonidas insists on this modification, then we will obey his wishes. Very well, said Krines, her anger seeming to deflate once she realized that her colleague would not be supporting her. We'll use the human's inefficient spell formula. From there everything seemed to move very quickly as the mages prepared for the opening of the portal. Krivax watched as Antonidas personally verified the functionality of each set of wards before double-checking the arcane glyph for any flaws. Feeling curious about the portal's security system, Krivax didn't hesitate to ask Hadix about it. There is no single security system for me to point out to you, Hadix explained patiently. Dalaran is using multiple layers of defense to protect the portal from being used unauthorized, and only a few of them can be seen from here. I'm sure many of their defense mechanisms are secrets known only to the upper echelons of their government. Well, what can you see from here? Krivax asked curiously. Hadix seemed to ponder the question for a moment before pointing out a specific portion of the glyph. There. That portion of the spell determines where the portal opens up to. Do you notice anything different about it, Krivax? asked Hades in the same tone of voice he used whenever he was teaching his student. Krivax stared at the portion that Hades pointed out for several moments before he realized what he was supposed to notice. "It's not using the ley line as a power source," said Krivax, amazed that they were able to connect different portions of the same spell to different sources of magic. "Correct, it's likely that the source of magic that maintains that portion of the spell is kept in a secret, heavily guarded location. If it were ever destroyed, then anyone who attempted to use the portal would find themselves in an unpredictable location, assuming they survived." Hades spent the next few minutes pointing out various security measures, including a ward that would allow a mage to scry a small area on the other side of the portal and a ward that would prevent anyone from passing through unless it was lowered. He would have kept going, but the vizier ended his explanation when it looked like they were ready to begin opening the portal. "You won't find anything, human," Crenus said smugly. "When it comes to spatial magic, my work is impeccable." "One can never be too sure," said Antonidas, turning his attention away from the glyph and focusing on one of his mages. "Magus Sparklecrank, has the ley line's throughput remained steady?" "Yes, Archmage," said an elderly male gnome. "And the levels of atmospheric arcane energy?" "Within acceptable parameters, Archmage." "Very well then," said Antonidas as he approached the designated portal location. "I will begin opening the portal. Everyone else, begin making preparations to welcome our guests." With that said, Antonidas gripped his staff tightly and didn't waste any time to begin casting the spell. Arcane magic immediately poured out of the man at levels that Krivax had never seen before. He was certain even the most magically incapable person would be able to sense the Grand Magus's magic. It didn't take very long before the entire room was glowing brightly with violet light, and a large tear in the very fabric of space was ripping open in the center of the room. As soon as the portal finished forming, the chamber quickly became a hive of activity. Wards are functional. Attempts to scry the other side of the portal have been successful. One individual is attempting to use the portal. Individual matches the description of Warrior Kralrel. Understood. Warrior Kralrel is on the pre-approved list. Permitting entry. Krivax watched in satisfaction as the first Nerubian stepped through a portal from Northrend to the Eastern Kingdoms. One by one, Nerubians were evaluated via scrying and permitted entry into Dalaran. Krivax did his best to translate between the guards and the arriving Nerubians as they did their best to organize everyone. It would have been nice if someone had remembered to cast a translation spell on the room. Fortunately, it didn't take very long for them to reach the last Nerubian on the list and his very large partner. Two individuals are attempting to use the portal. Individuals match the description of Wormhandler Kruzok and a Jawmonger. Understood. Wormhandler Kruzok and his Jawmonger are on the pre-approved list. Permitting entry. While the Nerubian that stepped through the portal was not visibly different from any other baseline Nerubian, the creature that followed behind him was enough to command the attention of every mage in the room. Slithering its way through the portal was an absolutely massive worm-like creature with rows of chisel-like teeth, a flattened, muscular body, and crystalline spines along its flanks. The Jawmonger was easily larger than a Spider-Lord, and Antonidas was quickly forced to expand the size of the room with magic to accommodate the creature. Every single mage in the room had stopped what they were doing to watch in astonishment as the Jawmonger finished passing through the portal. "Well then," said Antonidas, sounding uncharacteristically shocked. "I had thought that you were exaggerating the size of these creatures, but I can see now that you were not. Although I fail to see how such a massive creature will safely make its way through the building." Everyone who heard that took a moment to glance at each other awkwardly before staring pointedly at the Grand Magus. Antonidas merely let out an aggrieved sigh before pointing his staff toward the hallway and getting to work. Maybe a shrinking or polymorph spell would be easier? Krivax couldn't help but think for a moment before quickly brushing it off. Still, if nothing else, the arrival of the Jawmonger would help speed up construction of the Nerubian enclave, and become Azjol Nerub's first settlement outside of Northrend. It was a good start and something to be proud of. It was his own efforts that had made this possible, and now all he needed to worry about were several other matters that he needed to deal with. "I'm starting to think that what they say is true. The only reward for work well done really is just more work." Krivax had a gut feeling that things were soon about to become very busy. "And here is the cavern that the Enclave intends to use for storing food," said Krivax, gesturing towards a massive cavern completely covered with insect-filled webs. While neither Lordaeron nor Dalaran had a shortage of delicious shellfish, it was nice to have access to the insects he'd grown used to over the past few years. Krivax turned to look at the two individuals who Dalaran had sent to evaluate the Enclave's ongoing construction. "I see," said the city's guard captain, a middle-aged human man. "This is really impressive. It's hard to imagine such large tunnels were dug out in just a month." "Quite," said his mage companion, an elvish woman responsible for evaluating the Nerubians' magical defenses. "The wards are very well constructed as well, and fall within the agreed-upon regulations." While Dalaran didn't mind giving the Nerubians their own portion of the city to live in, the High Elves already did after all. There were obvious limits to what they could and could not do, which included the construction of certain wards. After all, the first priority of any government would always be its own safety. "Of course, Magistrix Autumnsinger," Krivax said diplomatically. "Every part of the Enclave's construction falls well within the regulations we agreed upon with the Council of Six." That wasn't even a lie, thankfully. Azjol-Nerub was not currently interested in invading Dalaran and was more than willing to honor the agreements it made, so long as doing so remained in their best interest. "I'm glad to hear that," said the elvish woman, turning to send an uncomfortable glance at a skitterer as it passed them by. "Have there been any difficulties building the tunnels around the underbelly?" "No, we haven't had any problems with that," Krivax said truthfully as he began walking down the cavern to continue their tour. "We sent a few of our warriors to properly map out the underbelly and worm handler Kruzok has done a good job directing the Jawmonger away from its tunnels. Our people have more than enough experience in such matters, so there's no need to worry." After the first time there was an accident caused by Dalaran's map of the underbelly not being completely accurate, something which was blamed on the slum's residents' illegal tunneling and expansion, the delegation had decided to scout out the sewers tunnels themselves. Krivax hadn't hesitated to take advantage of the situation by asking Masruk to learn as much as he could about the slum's residents, and more specifically the local goblins. Krivax was hoping to find someone willing to do some discreet work for the right price. Although he had been willing to act more patiently before while Azjol-Nerub solidified its diplomatic ties and he gradually increased his own magical ability, the signs that the Second War was close to entering full swing grew larger and larger by the day. Communication with Kaz Modan was nearly non-existent by this point, and people were expecting to hear news of refugees fleeing north across the Thandil span at any moment. All of this meant that Krivax would need to make preparations if he intended to interfere proactively in the war. The rest of the tour went fairly well, with Krivax showing them every part of the tunnels, including the various sleeping quarters separated by caste, a cavern filled with half-constructed structures which would eventually serve as a site for magical experimentation, a cavern just for the Jawmonger and other Nerubian beasts, and an exclusive area meant to hold the Enclave's local queen and possibly a few experimental eggs. There were also some more mundane sections such as the main government building representing Azjol-Nerub and a guest area for those non-Nerubians who choose to stay overnight in the Enclave. There were likely lots of little things he was missing too, but he didn't know the ins and outs of every single room in the Enclave. That would be up to those living and working here. The tunnels running throughout the Enclave were lined with arcane lights and glowing fungi for light, along with webs made of silk more solid and inflexible than what Krivax was used to in Azjol-Nerub. This was mostly for the convenience of their non-Nerubian guests, who would have found it much more difficult to walk on the silk they usually used. Not to mention the need to make use of fewer non-vertical surfaces since non-Nerubians couldn't easily just climb a wall or ceiling to get around. Eventually, they reached the last part of their tour, which was a large cavern that would eventually house the Enclave's cigarette. However, there wasn't much to see yet, with only a few weavers and skitterers laying down the building's foundation. It didn't take very long after that before Krivax was waving goodbye to the two inspectors, who were both more than eager to leave the subterranean enclave the moment their work was concluded. As soon as they were gone, Krivax allowed himself to relax and let out a sigh of relief. He hadn't been wrong to assume that his days were going to grow busier after the opening of the portal to Inkilla, but things had gone surprisingly well so far and Krivax couldn't help but feel glad. Just as he was about to return to his room to reward himself by snacking on a particularly delicious breed of scorpion native to the Howling Fjord, Krivax was suddenly interrupted by a nervous voice coming from behind him. "Vizier Krivax?" Turning quickly at the sound of his name, Krivax relaxed when he saw that it was just one of the initiates sent by the Circle to learn in Dalaran. "Yes, Initiate Selmit? How can I help you?" asked Krivax. "I would like to request your assistance in finding the classroom for my scheduled lesson," said Initiate Selmit as he fidgeted nervously. Krivax knew that most viziers would never deign to assist an initiate with something so small, but he had gained a certain reputation for being different. "You've been in Dalaran for a while now, why are you still having trouble finding your classes?" Krivax asked patiently. "I find it difficult to adjust to the surface," said Selmit after a moment of hesitant silence. "The layout of their city makes no sense to me, and the sun and the sky can be overwhelming." That was a feeling common to many of the Nerubians who had no experience with the surface. Much of the delegation was the same at first, even though they got over it fast, so Krivax found it hard to blame the initiate. After all, he knew more than most that getting used to a new situation drastically different from what you were used to before was not easy. "Of course, Initiate," said Krivax in his best patient mentor voice, ignoring the fact that the initiate was likely biologically older than him and had probably been studying magic for longer than him as well. "I was just about to start making my way to Runeweave Square anyway, so you're welcome to join me." That was a lie, but he should probably actually start making his way there given that Cross's lesson in advanced polymorphic transmutation was scheduled to start soon. Aside from the lesson being an excellent opportunity for him to stalk Cross's back to his lair, he was also quite interested in listening to the Archmage's lesson itself. Dragons possessed a natural talent for shape-shifting magic, so Krivax wouldn't be surprised if Cross's knew more about the subject than anyone else in the city. With a relieved nod, Selmit skittered to his side and the two of them began making their way up into Dalaran, the surface entrance to the enclave being located near the edge of the city proper. As Krivax led the initiate to Runeweave Square, he glanced at the surrounding pedestrians and felt a hint of wonder at how quickly the people of Dalaran were growing used to the giant spider people among them. Most still gave a short stare and shared some quiet whispers when they saw them, but it was growing less and less each day as they simply became a regular sight in the city. It didn't take very long before Krivax was ushering the initiate into a classroom in which an elvish mage was giving an introductory lecture on enchanting. Many of the students turned to stare at them, but Krivax ignored them as he waved Selmit goodbye and left to begin making his way to the portion of Runeweaver Square dedicated to more advanced lessons. Let's see. Advanced Elemental Abjuration, Foundational Construct Conjuration, Tangible Illusion Construction. Advanced Polymorphic Transmutation by Archmage Cross's Cinder Depth. Krivax paused for a moment as he realized that this was the first time he ever read anything about Cross's having a surname. It wasn't something that he had ever thought about before, simply assuming that the people who wrote Warcraft's lore were too lazy to give last names to all of their characters, but it stood out to him now that it had been brought to his attention. Does Antonidas have a last name? Does Kael'thas? I know Kael'thas and Ansiram have last names. But does everyone else? Is this just some kind of weird mage thing? Krivax forcibly pushed these thoughts away and stepped into the classroom. He could always look into it later when he had the time. While most of the previous classrooms he had seen in Dalaran reminded him of some of the lecture halls he'd seen during college, this one was much smaller in comparison, likely due to the smaller number of mages attending the advanced class. The students themselves seemed older and more mature than the ones he had seen in Arcanist Flame Trail's class or any of the introductory classes he'd seen over the past month. Several of them were likely fully fledged mages who were simply looking to learn a new skill from an archmage. Under the assessing gazes of said mages, Krivax found himself a convenient spot near the back of the classroom and folded his legs under himself as he sat down. It seemed that nobody had remembered to prepare a cushion for the classroom, and none of the chairs were built to accommodate a Nerubian. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long before the dragon that he wanted to see came walking into the classroom and immediately began drawing out two different arcane glyphs on the board at the front of the class. Unlike runes, arcane glyphs generally served as a visual representation of a particular piece of spellcraft and did not possess any power on their own. Krivax had studied enough transmutation to know that these particular glyphs represented two similar spells related to the polymorph spell, although he was having trouble understanding the differences between the two. Croesus very quickly finished drawing the two glyphs and turned to address the classroom, nodding an acknowledgement to Krivax before beginning his lecture. One of the most difficult challenges mages have when delving into advanced polymorphic transmutations is understanding the difference between polymorphic themselves and polymorphic an external entity, began Croesus, his voice easily carrying throughout the room. All of you should understand the 4 regulations regarding polymorphic magic. Croesus paused for a moment before directing his gaze to a dwarvish man, one of the few that Krivax had seen studying magic in Dalaran. Mage Timor, name these 4 regulations, said Croesus, causing everyone to turn their attention to the dwarf. Why yes, Archmage, said the dwarf, obviously nervous at being the center of attention. The 4 regulations are the following: do not turn a creature of lesser intelligence into a creature of higher intelligence, only use pre-approved creatures for polymorphs, do not polymorph inanimate objects, and never polymorph anything that is halfway through a portal. Correct, said Croesus, returning his focus back to the rest of the class, much to the dwarf's relief. Those of you who are more perceptive will note that 3 of these 4 regulations are a result of the natural differences between the minds of different creatures or entities, which naturally causes significant difficulties when attempting to transform one entity into another. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the infamous Mer-Elf incident if you wish for an example of what might happen as a result of these difficulties. At Croesus's words, a collective shudder passed through the gathered mages. Krivax wasn't sure what the infamous Mer-Elf incident was, but he could guess by the name and immediately felt more cautious about experimenting with such magic. To be able to safely polymorph oneself necessitates the ability to account for such differences, said Croesus, ignoring the discomfort of the students. And a mage capable of doing so is naturally also able to ignore these regulations. With that said, Croesus didn't hesitate to give a demonstration by casting a spell on the piece of chalk in his hand, immediately transforming it into a large snake that began slithering its way up the Archmage's arm. Learning how to account for these differences will not be enough if you wish to change your form at will, but it is an important first step, said Croesus, turning the snake back into a piece of chalk with a wave of his hand, much to the amazement of the gathered mages. Today, I will teach you what you need to know to take this step if you have the drive to do so. He listened to the lecture with interest as the Archmage explained aspects of transmutation that Krivax had never thought of before. He knew that the ability to mimic the dragon's natural shapeshift was still far from reach, but Krivax couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if he could easily change his form. He was never the kind of person to dwell on things outside of his control, which was why he put so much effort into adjusting himself to his new body instead of wasting his time mourning his lost humanity. Even back when he had been Sam instead of Krivax, he had always been more of a go-with-the-flow kind of guy. However, being confronted with the possibility that he might be able to change his form sometime in the future made him feel more than a little conflicted. He didn't mind being a giant spider person, he even found the fact that he had 4 arms to be extremely convenient. But it would be nice to have the ability to shift into a human form every once in a while, at least just so that he could remember what it felt like. Although listening to this lecture, I get the feeling that I'm probably not going to be at that level anytime soon, Krivax thought self-deprecatingly. He decided to push his troublesome thoughts away before he gave himself a case of species dysmorphia. Krivax listened to the rest of the lecture with rapt attention, making careful notes of things that didn't understand for him to ask Hadix about later. Croesus proved himself to be an able and patient teacher, answering every question asked with clarity. He also gave plenty of warnings about the dangers of experimenting with transmutation magic without proper guidance and shared examples of things that had happened to mages who didn't heed those warnings. Krivax had no idea why anyone would think that it was a good idea to turn themselves into a chair of all things. Sometimes it seemed like mages just had a tendency to make really ridiculous decisions. I really hope I don't end up like that, thought Krivax as he tried to banish the image of a meat chair from his mind. The lesson went on for nearly 2 hours before the Archmage declared it over, causing the gathered mages to begin packing up their things and start making their way to the door. Krivax was just about to follow their lead and begin making preparations for his dragon-stalking adventure when he was interrupted by the sound of said dragon calling his name. Vizier Krivax, if you wouldn't mind sparing a moment of your time, there's a matter that I wish to discuss with you. Yes, Archmage. How can I help you? Krivax asked nervously after approaching the dragon, surprised that he wanted to speak with him. Does he know something? Krivax wondered, quickly examining his mental shields for any signs of intrusion. He knew that it was irrational, but he couldn't help but worry that Archmage somehow knew what he was planning. Thank you for staying behind, Vizier Krivax, Croesus said kindly, offering him a polite smile. I just wanted to take the opportunity to ask again about your delegation's intentions to share more information about Northrend. Krivax felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as he realized that the dragon just wanted to probe him again about what information they intended to share with the Eastern Kingdoms. He most likely wanted to know how much Azjol Nerub knew about the dragons and Windrest Temple. While I'm afraid that I can't personally share much about Northrend yet, I can tell you that Azjol Nerub intends to share more information soon, Krivax said truthfully. Oh? On what topic? Asked Croesus, the picture of polite curiosity. If Krivax didn't know that this was a topic that the Archmage had a personal interest in, he would almost certainly have believed that he was only mildly curious. High King Anubarek has given our delegation permission to explain why we have forbidden entry to certain portions of Northrend's surface, said Krivax, causing the tiny amount of tension that had entered the dragon's expression to dissipate. Azjol Nerub had finally secured the Vrukhal's resting places enough that even the most conservative of Nerubians found there to be little threat in sharing information about them with the humans. I'm sure many of our scholars will be glad to hear that. Some of them have been very enthusiastic in their speculation, said Croesus, chuckling softly. When do you intend to share that information? We haven't really decided the best time to do so, but I imagine it will be sometime soon, said Krivax. There's no particular reason to wait after all. That's certainly true. Do you have intentions of sharing before you leave Dalaran? If the information is important enough to require the approval of your High King before you can share it, then I imagine it must be quite interesting, said Croesus enthusiastically. I admit, I'm looking forward to seeing how the scholars react to what you wish to share. Krivax knew that he probably was looking forward to it, especially since the dragon likely already knew that they intended to share information about the Vrukal. I can bring the suggestion forward to the rest of the delegation, Archmage, but we haven't made a decision yet on the topic. I appreciate it, but there's no need to go out of your way to indulge me for such a small thing, said Croesus, shaking his head and smiling at him with good nature before quickly changing the subject. How did you enjoy my lessons? Did you have any problems understanding anything? At the Archmage's question, Krivax's expression immediately lit up and he quickly retrieved his notebook from his spatial bag. Actually, yes there were. If you wouldn't mind answering a few questions, there are a few things that I could use some help understanding. Of course, said Croesus, smiling gently. I wouldn't mind at all. Krivax didn't hesitate to question the Archmage about everything that confused him about transmutation. Croesus was just as patient answering his questions in a private setting as he was during the lecture, and Krivax could feel his admiration for the dragon grow the longer he spoke with him. A part of him wanted to just come out and tell Croesus everything that he knew about Deathwing and the many threats that Azeroth would face in the future, but Krivax knew that he wouldn't be able to bring himself to do so. Even if Krivax considered himself to be a relatively kind and empathetic person, he knew that he was not a trusting one. It had taken him several years before he had even considered sharing his meta-knowledge with his closest friend, so there wasn't much chance of him spilling his guts to a relative stranger. Even as kind as Croesus seemed to be, Krivax simply didn't know him well enough to extend that kind of trust if other options were available to him. But as long as Kaz Modan had still not yet fallen and Alexstrasza was not in immediate danger, he still felt like he had enough time to share information with Croesus in a way that would hide his identity. Was it paranoia? Most likely, but considering how he was technically a part of a secret organization that had hidden in the shadows for thousands of years, that is probably a good quality to have. Are you sure that there's nothing else you need me to explain? Asked Croesus after Krivax finished running through every question written down in his notebook. Yes, Archmage, Krivax said gratefully. Thank you for your time. This has done a lot to help me understand some of the more difficult parts of the polymorph spell. And it was true. Although Krivax had already had a bit of success in learning how to cast polymorph, the spell was incredibly nuanced and there was a lot about it that he still had to learn. I'm glad that I could be of assistance, said Croesus. Your people have done a lot to breathe a breath of fresh air into this city. For many reasons, Dalaran has a tendency to stagnate, so the introduction of new magic and ideas into the city is far more valuable than a few moments of my time. Krivax thanked the man again for his time and began making his way out of the classroom while checking through his telepathic connection that the flyer he had brought with him to Runeweaver Square was still where he left it. Back during the conversation that he had with Hadix right before his first meeting with Trixie in Moki Harbor, the Vizier had mentioned that a flyer had been surveilling the village for signs of visitors from the Eastern Kingdom. At the time, Krivax had wondered how the Vizier had been able to find out what the flyer saw so quickly, but he had saved his questions until later. He didn't get a straight answer on the matter until after he officially joined the Order and learned exactly what magic they had used. Krivax didn't pause as he cast the spell which would split a part of his mind to look through the perspective of the flyer hiding on top of one of the roofs in Runeweaver Square, waiting for Crossus to appear. Aside from being relatively small and hard to spot, the flyer was also being hidden from notice by a lesser version of the same spell that Hadix usually used to sneak around, an abjuration-based spell that caused people not to pay attention to things under its notice. Given that it was a spell cast by Krivax, it would naturally not do much against a mage as powerful as Crossus if he was being vigilant, but it didn't need to. All it needed to do was make sure that none of the other pedestrians noticed the flyer as it followed the dragon back to his lair. Crossus had no reason to be particularly worried that someone would be following him, so as long as nobody was pointing and screaming at the flying spider bat, then it was unlikely that he would notice a thing. Krivax calmly started walking back to the enclave as the flyer began stalking the dragon once he left the classroom. It would really make my life much easier if an Archmage's address was public information. Please just go home, Mr. Dragon. I really don't want to follow you all day as you do your chores. As Crossus failed to make his way to the residential area and instead started heading to the section of the city that held the Violet Citadel, Krivax felt his hopes start to fall. The Archmage did indeed go to several locations that were obviously not his home as Krivax immediately isolated himself in his room the moment he reached the enclave. At least the magic is doing its job. A part of him had expected to immediately fail, resulting in him being confronted by an angry dragon wizard, but Crossus had not shown any signs of noticing that he was being followed. Of course, that didn't exactly guarantee that the dragon hadn't actually noticed, but Krivax was choosing to be optimistic. The flyer continued to follow Crossus for the next 30 minutes until he eventually reached a nondescript house near the edge of the district. Feeling curious, Krivax extended his magical senses through the flyer to inspect the building, only for him to feel as if his heart jumped out of his chest after noticing that Crossus immediately stopped moving once he did so. Fuck. Did I just reveal myself? I've never heard anything from Hadix about mages being able to notice another mage's magical senses. Krivax felt himself stop breathing as he waited for an angry wizard to teleport right next to him and ask him why he was following him. After what felt like an eternity, but was more likely just a few tense moments, Crossus began moving again as if nothing was wrong and calmly entered the building. The moment the Archmage was out of sight, he quickly directed the flyer away from the building and instructed it to fly back to the enclave. Only then did Krivax allow himself to start breathing again. Although his quest to find out where Crossus lived was seemingly successful, he wasn't completely sure how to feel. A part of him was convinced that the dragon had noticed something, but if so then why didn't he do anything about it? After spending a few minutes thinking over the matter, Krivax decided that he didn't know enough about Crossus to come up with an answer. I hope that it was just my imagination. Still, now that he knew where the Archmage lived, it wouldn't be particularly difficult to arrange for a letter to be sent anonymously to the location. Even if the wards made it impossible for someone like Krivax to approach the building undetected, a little bit of gold to serve as motivation and a few clever uses of magic to hide his identity would be enough to make the arrangements. Feeling cautiously optimistic, Krivax plucked a howling fjord scorpion from the frostweave in the corner of his room and rewarded himself for a job semi-well done. Just as he was finishing his meal and was about to begin planning out exactly what he intended to write in the letter, Krivax was interrupted by a skitterer frantically running into his room and delivering a letter before immediately running back out. Not hesitating to push aside his previous plans, Krivax opened the letter and began reading. Although the letter was short and the details it contained were sparse, its contents were enough to completely change many of his plans. After all, now that most of Khazmodan had been conquered by the Horde and what refugees that had successfully fled the region were saying about Ironforge and Nomeregan being under siege, he didn't have very much time left to wait. It was now or never.